Hello and welcome to my presentation on my dissertation with the provisional title of Housing Welfare Policy and Community Cohesion, a longitudinal study of Becontree estate. What am I researching and why? My research question: to what extent have housing welfare policies determined community cohesion in Becontree estate? From this, my aims are to understand how different housing welfare policies have determined community cohesion in Becontree estate over its 100-year history, and to provide an explanation for pervasive white nationalist ideologies in areas that rely heavily on housing welfare. So my objectives: to establish possible causes of differing levels of community cohesion and racial polarisation at three separate conjunctures, to compare community and council discourse regarding social housing and multiculturalism, to examine the impact of commodifying council housing on community identities, and to investigate present-day barriers preventing community cohesion. My rationale for this research is firstly highlighted by the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, who have concern over community cohesion due to conflict over access to social housing that has increased with the influx of immigration, with some people in the community believing that those immigrants are being prioritised in terms of accessing welfare resources. The other rationales are there are currently celebrations of the centenary of the estate, which are increasing community engagement, giving the opportunity for this research to act as action research. A conjunctural analysis has also not yet been applied to points of crisis in Becontree estate. And low community cohesion for Becontree estate residents epitomises a national council housing crisis. So this research will hope to discover the key social processes linked to housing policies and how this can be utilised in future studies. The background and context of my research, I would like to talk about the three separate conjunctures that I am studying in the estate's 100-year history. Firstly, it will be in the 1920s, where there was a post-World War II socialist ideology inspiring the construction of the Homes for Heroes estate. Architecture and community guidelines were structured in alignment with the Garden City movement theory, whereby cohesion was prioritised. In the 1980s, the 1981 Right to Buy scheme gave council tenants the opportunities to buy their homes, and therefore disparities in economic privilege became clearly identifiable. The uniformity of the one-class estate became fractured. Not everyone rented for the council anymore. And so, neoliberal and individual ideology were inserted into housing welfare policy, which undoubtedly had an effect on community structure and cohesion. The third conjuncture is in the 2010s, where austerity measures and an influx of immigration have increased reliance on housing welfare, yet council homes are not being built, and almost 50,000 have been lost as of 2008. Almost 6,000 people remained on the housing register. These figures are undoubtedly higher today. So conflict over council housing resources have resulted in hate crime and decreased life satisfaction and self-perception. Efforts by the local council to improve cohesion involve community projects and police enforcement, while the issue of council housing stock has remained largely unaddressed. And so it is my argument that unless the issue of council housing stock is addressed, the issue of community cohesion will not be remedied, and racial polarisation is predictable, considering that the resources that everyone hopes to acquire are not enough to go around. The theoretical framework I'm using is conflict theory, which believes that people do not necessarily share the same values or desire the same ends, but sometimes these ends desired are incompatible with those desired by another. It may be possible for a compromise to be reached, but if not, conflict may be inevitable. Whoever achieves dominance is likely to present its values as the norm. History, as they say, is written by the winners. Below, there is a graph showing that Barking and Dagenham between 2001 and 2011 experienced the highest influx of immigration out of every London borough. Why conflict theory? as opposed to functionalism, which views societies as being held together by a consensus of shared values, and conflict arises due to societal malfunctions that can be cured. However, this frames immigrants as anomalies within the shared value system, who then need to conform to the dominant ideology and values of Becontree Estate's residents. Yet, conflict theory views conflict as natural within a plural society, yet uneven distribution of power and resources exasperates agonism, which is disagreement among adversaries, into antagonism, which is conflict between enemies. It can be argued from this that if the resources and distribution of those resources were equal among different nationalities, among different classes, then agonism would be possible, where people can compromise, as opposed to antagonism. What are the key issues emerging from the literature that I've studied? Firstly, Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony, which is a process of spontaneous consent where the dominant group in a society manipulate public beliefs, perceptions, values, norms, and prejudices to benefit the interests of capitalism. Stuart Hall's conjunctural crisis is when political, economic, social, and ideological conditions contradict in times of crisis to form a revised cultural hegemony that can either result in reform or exploitation. And this is why I'm studying the three separate conjunctures in the history of this estate. They all present a time of crisis, and from that time of crisis, a new hegemonic culture, a new discourse was presented. And unfortunately, that has resulted in exploitation rather than reform. Why is that? So, David Harvey's Accumulation by Dispossession states that neoliberal policies centralize power and wealth by dispossessing public resources. So, what does this present in terms of a gap in knowledge that I hope to fill? The utility of a conjunctural analysis as a form of action research for communities of low cohesion due to welfare policies. How can my research potentially contribute to existing work? I would like to discover whether mutual aid as a way of repossessing public resources can dismantle neoliberal policies. So, David Harvey states that neoliberal policies centralize power by dispossessing public resources. If we repossess public resources via mutual aid, then perhaps it can work backwards in terms of decentralizing power and wealth and decentralizing the ability for neoliberal policies to take hold in working class estates. I would also like to discover the accuracy of a conjunctural analysis to predict and prevent future exploitation in times of crisis, in order to ensure at times of crisis reform is possible rather than exploitation. Next are my methods and potential ethical issues. I will be interviewing people using the life history interview method, which looks to understand a community via descriptions of the lives of a few of its individuals. I will be analysing this with mixed method of conjunctural analysis as a means of historical periodization, placing emphasis on crisis as a driving force of history, and also critical discourse analysis, the use of language as a form of social practice, which are tied to historical context and on the means by which existing social relations are reproduced and contested at different interests are served. How do I justify this? Well, self-reporting of past and present identifications and beliefs may reveal how certain discourses have shaped understandings of the past and how this is used to legitimize community structure in the present. Life history interviews are not always very accurate. People will have trouble properly describing how they felt and their values from decades prior. However, despite their inaccuracy, I can use this to my disposal by trying to analyse the discourses that make their recounting of their past skewed, and how the discourse of the past, how that goes on to form their ideas about how the community should be structured in the present. My design will be a longitudinal case study. We are in the process of historicising the present, understanding current discourses, understanding how past conjunctures have presented themselves as issues of multiculturalism. And so to do that, a longitudinal design is necessary. It will be in the form of a cohort design, whereby data is collected over time from samples that share similar characteristics. These commonalities may be a shared experience, event, or demographic indicator. So from the 1920s, in that conjuncture, I will have to use secondary data that is archived at the local museum in Barking and Dagenham. And I will be triangulating the results and analysis of that data with the life history interviews I will be doing with present day residents of Becontree Estate. Fieldwork. I'll be interviewing people in Barking and Dagenham or on a Teams video call. There will be approximately 20 interviews for 30 minutes. Ethics. So, some ethical concerns are the anonymisation of secondary data sources when the data is not publicly available, and also participant distress when recounting experiences of marginalisation. You can read more about my ethical concerns and how I hope to minimise those concerns in my ethical form. My chapter headings are as follows: council housing and community cohesion, conflict theory and hegemony, life history interviews with Becontree Estate residents, conjunctural analysis of qualitative data, and identifying barriers to social cohesion. In the next column, it is the contents of each chapter, and then the main references I hope to use. Please pause and have a look if you'd like to study this a little bit more. And here are my references for the current presentation I'm doing now. Thank you so much for listening. On this slide, there is some artwork done by Verity Jane Keefe and Wouter Osterhout as a part of the Becontree Forever projects, and where they are detailing what they hope for our community to be one day, which is exactly why I am doing this research. Thank you again for listening.